Hey, hey Adam, how's it going?
Goodwill, how you doing?
Good. So this is the fantasy formula with FanAmp and F1 Fantasy, right there, right right there. And I'm Will Gray. I work at FanAmp, and I am a big F1 fan, but a fantasy newbie, and I'm here to learn with all of y'all from the master, this guy right here, how to play fantasy and how to do well in it. So Adam, take it away.
Thanks, Will. And thanks to FanAmp for putting this on. I'm really excited to get you ready for the Canadian Grand Prix. So, for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Adam Medeiros. I'm the founder of F1FantasyHQ.com. I also have a pretty active Twitter and Reddit presence. And of course, I have a community on FanAmp where I answer live questions both about Formula One and about the fantasy game. And last season, I finished in the top 1,000 teams out of 1.6 million worldwide. So hopefully, I'm bringing some success to our Q&A tonight.
Awesome. Don't forget to join us on FanAmp and YouTube and ask questions through the live chat or on the app as well. So with that being said, let's get right into it.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to start with a recap from Spain. And here are the four things we're going to break down. First is the disappointing day for Lando Norris. Then we're going to talk about two of the budget driver darlings in fantasy Formula One this year. That's Yuki Tsunoda and Zhou Guanyu. And then we're going to talk about the crazy qualifying result. He had a lot of unexpected finishes, both high and low in the qualifying result last week. So we're going to break those down and what that meant for fantasy results. Will, what did you think of Spain?
Spain was really exciting for me. I mean, there was a lot of new upgrades being shown by a couple of teams, which proved pretty useful for most teams, especially Mercedes, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But Lando did really well in qualifying, kind of surprising with how the season's been going. Unfortunately, he hit someone, in the first lap, so that didn't turn out great. Yuki was really good. Honestly, I don't think the penalty was warranted, but I'm not an FIA steward, so I wouldn't be able to tell you. Zhou was, again, impressive. I'd be interested to see what he can do in, a better car, which is, I think, something we need to keep on our minds going into next season, especially during silly season. And, a lot of people going up and down. Charles Leclerc finishing, P17, and Hülkenberg finishing in the top 10 was crazy. It was really fun weekend to watch, and I'm excited for this next one too.
Me too. All right, let's get started a little chat about Lando Norris.
Right. So Lando was really good in qualifying. He qualified P3. Unfortunately, he took a hit with Hamilton and had to pit early. Finished P17, which isn't great. And I don't know much about fantasy yet, but I do know that finishing P17 after starting P3 probably isn't a good thing.
It's not good at all. And really, the main issue here is that he lost 14 positions, which every one of these positions that you lose, it's -1 point in the fantasy game. So that left Lando with the lowest fantasy total of the week with -2 points. And had he stayed P3, he would have finished with at least 23 points, plus whatever overtakes he accrued during the race. And although, just to be fair, Lando did admit after the race he'd be hard-pressed to finish in the points, but it's disappointing to see him tumble so much.
Yeah. He looks sad in that photo, to be fair.
Sure does.
So what do you think about Lando in general as a fantasy asset? I know he hasn't been great this season in terms of finishing result, but I'm wondering if that's slightly different in fantasy.
Unfortunately, it's much the same in fantasy. And how we rank value for drivers in the game is points scored per $1 million of fake money that you spend to bring these players onto your team, or PPM for short. Lando ranks 17th among all drivers in PPM, so a very, very low value for what you pay for him.
Right.
Lando's only got one race with double-digit fantasy points. That was way back in Australia. And he has fewer points than drivers who are much cheaper than him, guys like Magnussen, Bottas, and Yuki Tsunoda, who we're going to talk about in just a minute, who all cost much less than him.
Makes sense.
So I think now's a good time to talk about Yuki because he had another great week. Will, do you want to recap us on how Yuki's day went in Spain?
Yeah, so Yuki was on track to finish P9, which would have been a great result for him. would have been his third points of the season, I believe, which is something very hard to do in an AlphaTauri, as we've seen, especially since it seems like this car has been getting worse and worse by the year instead of better and better. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what Yuki Tsunoda could do nowadays in the 2021 AlphaTauri, which was slightly competitive back then. But unfortunately, due to a penalty against Zhou Guanyu, they're saying you didn't leave enough space in the corner. You know, I'm a big Yuki fan, so I might be biased, but I think that was a little bit of, you know, a crap penalty. I'm going to put it with some nice words, you know what I mean? But yeah, it was unfortunate he had to finish, I believe, P12 at the end. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, what does that mean in terms of his fantasy prospects?
He didn't have a bad day when it was all said and done. He finished with 11 fantasy points, which ranks second amongst the budget drivers. And by budget drivers, I mean anyone who costs $5 million or less. Had he finished P9, he would have had 16 points, and he would have been tied with Zhou Guanyu for the most among budget drivers, but he still had a pretty solid day. And I agree with you, Will. I think Zhou volunteered himself off the track a little early, and maybe that penalty didn't have to happen. But Yuki's having a fantastic year. He's consistently between P10 and P12, and he's avoiding these mistakes from previous years that had cost him valuable points and led to early DNFs. Besides the one sprint race DNF in Azerbaijan, he's having a really good year and avoiding those mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, compared to past years, he's making a lot less mistakes, and that can just be seen in his, you know, lower amount of DNFs. He's still fun to hear on the radio. He gets pretty mad still. He's a great guy. I mean, I think he's a great guy. I've never met him, but he's a cool dude. He's a good driver. I think a lot better than most people think. And I'm interested to see what else he can do this season. But what does that mean in terms of, like, is he a good driver in fantasy? Like, compared to the other quote unquote budget drivers that you mentioned, what's his ranking, you know?
Well, I think Yuki's been, like you said, one of the more consistent and higher value budget drivers in the game this year. Most weeks he's turning in a solid result for players that pick him. And I think he's a perfectly fine budget driver week in and week out. But for me, there's one budget driver I just mentioned a moment ago that I think is the most consistent and the best value for fantasy teams this week and moving forward. And that's Zhou Guanyu. Let's talk about him next. So Zhou Guanyu has been, again, just a really bright spot for Alfa Romeo this year. Another P9 result in Spain last time out. It was his fourth double-digit fantasy point week of the season. And that's as many as both AlphaTauri's, Nico Hülkenberg, and Logan Sargent combined. So definitely a high-scoring and consistent fantasy asset week in and week out.
And also cheap, right?
He's also cheap. That's right. He is the fourth highest PPM in the game. So in terms of value, he's behind only Verstappen, Perez, and Alonso. And he's also the ninth highest scoring driver in the game, despite driving an Alfa Romeo.
Yeah, that's impressive. I mean, he's ninth on the grid and ninth in the game, so then maybe there's some correlation there. We keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Zhou is driving incredible for the car he has. I mean, he's really doing well. I mean, if you look at Bottas, who's you know, sitting in the back of the grid, unlike his previous, you know, Silver Arrow glory, I'm sure you know. But you know, what is it like? How much different is Bottas's fantasy scoring than Zhou's?
Well, Valtteri was a popular choice last year because he had a really, really hot start and was a pretty cheap fantasy asset, but he failed to finish in the points in 10 of his last 13 races. And in 2023, he's 0 for his last 6 races, finishing in the top 10. So Valtteri's having a very cold stretch, and that's translating to poor fantasy results. And considering that Bottas is priced around the same as Stroll and Gasly, we're going to talk about them in a second. They're both scoring much more than Valtteri is at this point, so I can't recommend him going forward. But Zhou, he's looking really good.
That makes sense. I mean, maybe he needs to change his haircut. That mullet might be a bad luck charm from what I've seen. Maybe he should stick to cycling. I know he does that on the weekends. But moving on from Bottas' cycling career, I was thinking, you know, Hülkenberg qualifies really well. And we know Haas, which is somehow a faster car during qualifying than the Alfa Romeos, and usually the AlphaTauris as well. But he doesn't always seem to finish inside the points. So what does that mean for his fantasy prospects?
Yeah, when we compare Hülkenberg and Zhou, I can see the temptation to go with Hulk. You have a seasoned driver who's in a car that has good straight line speed. But the problem is how high he qualifies. And this is counterintuitive to what you might think. Hulkenberg often qualifies high and then loses positions over the course of the race. So in Spain, he started P7 after the multiple Gasly penalties, but he lost 8 places in the race. And then in Bahrain, he lost an additional 5 places. So these are 2 big examples of when he's lost a lot of positions in the race. But meanwhile, Zhou is just the opposite. He leads all drivers in overtakes. He had 8 overtakes in Bahrain and Saudi and a whopping 10 overtakes in Spain last week. So huge performance. He also stole fastest lap in one of the first races of this season too. So he's really doing it all right now.
Crazy you can do fastest lap in an Alfa Romeo. That's nuts.
It was a very interesting circumstance how he got it. And when you're looking for a budget driver, you want to find someone who qualifies fairly low but has the potential and speed and strategy to overcome and overtake positions over the course of the race, and then not make so many mistakes that they can benefit when other drivers DNF.
Okay, so that makes sense. I mean, you want someone with race pace rather than qualifying pace is what you're telling me.
Correct.
Okay. Makes sense.
Now, the last topic for Spain is to talk about the qualifying results, because things were really all over the map.
So, yeah, I mean, what do you think about the qualifying results in terms of fantasy points?
So we had a few outliers from what you would have expected, right? We talked about Hulkenberg a moment ago starting P7 and then dropping positions. There were 2 interesting examples. One was George Russell. He started P12, but then finished the race P3, and he was the 3rd highest scoring driver in fantasy. He was the 3rd highest scoring driver despite a terrible qualifying because of how many overtakes and positions gained he made. So he made up the points through those overtakes and through his race pace. On the flip side, you have someone like Leclerc who started outside of Q1 and then didn't really make too many positions up during the course of the race, really didn't live up to the high price that he brings week in and week out. So these are examples of drivers that start low. They might not always finish high. So you have to find that right value.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Leclerc and Ferrari, who haven't been doing well, unfortunately for me, if you guys didn't know, I'm a Ferrari guy. Yeah, this guy's Mercedes for whatever reason. But speaking of Ferrari, they had pretty good laps today during free practice 2 and 1. What do you think about that?
It was a very interesting day for free practice. For anyone that missed it, FP1 was largely not happening. We had Gasly red flag the session early because he had some gearbox issues. And then the CCTV on the track had totally lost itself and they were unable to resolve it in the course of the session. They then extended FP2 to 90 minutes, and the last few minutes of the session was pretty heavy rain. So it was an interesting result. We'll talk a little bit about who finished 1-2, and that was Mercedes, and we'll talk about some of their momentum in recent weeks. See how I switched that to Mercedes right around from Ferrari?
Yeah. I bet you're happy about that one, huh?
We're going to talk about...
We'll see in quali.
We will. We're also going to talk about the battle for the number 4 driver. I think one of the hottest topics in and around the Spain weekend that's carried through to Canada. And then we're going to talk about the ever-evolving weather report and what does that mean for a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, so I'm really excited for this weekend. Let's go to Mercedes first of all. I mean,
let's do it.
Double podium in Spain, and although I see that's points per million on the side there, it looks low for what they have just achieved.
Yeah, and there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic about Mercedes this week. Obviously, you just mentioned the double podium in Spain. Lewis achieved his first race win in Formula One back in 2007 at this track, and Lewis is tied with Schumacher for the most wins all time in Canada with 7. They also finished 1-2 in FP2 today. But despite all that, I'm still not ready to recommend them in fantasy, mostly because of their high price. And you can see we've compared them here to Fernando Alonso and Max Verstappen. The combination of Verstappen and Alonso is 5.7 million cheaper than the combination of Mercedes drivers, but the Verstappen-Alonso pair scored 191 more points than the Mercedes.
Verstappen and Alonso were cheaper together than Hamilton and Russell?
Yes.
What?
The pricing is one of the biggest complaints in the fantasy game this year. And I wrote an article earlier this week with some recommendations of how to fix the pricing. The short version of it is if you just do what they did in the second half of last season, have set a target PPM for each driver and slowly move the drivers toward that target. And don't be afraid to move prices outside of this little window on Sunday. Move them up all 7 days of the week in pursuit of that target PPM, and it's going to open up a lot of viable roster opportunities. You can
Yeah,
see Alonso is almost twice as valuable in this game as the reigning world champion. Something's not right.
yeah, no, it doesn't really make much sense. But I mean, it is what it is. We don't make the rules.
That's true. That's true. And also, I'm not sure about Mercedes this week because an unusual number of people on the team have come out to temper expectations. We had one of their on-track engineers, Toto Wolff, and George Russell all come out and say, don't expect a double podium this week. This track doesn't suit us as well as Spain did, which I don't know if they're playing coy or if they're really setting themselves a low bar rightfully as we look ahead to Canada.
After FP2, it kind of seems like they might be playing coy. I mean, just saying. But like you said and mentioned to me earlier was that Verstappen and Red Bull seem to be running a different car setup this weekend in hopes of maybe a little bit more reliability.
That's right. And really, all the reports I saw out of FP2 indicate that Max wasn't really pushing it. It was either a tuned down engine or a focus on longer stints. Like, I wouldn't put too much stock in the fact that he finished outside the top 3 in FP2. I think it was just setup and preparation and what Red Bull were focusing on in the session.
Yes, we'll see in FP3.
That's right.
But yeah. So who's the number 4 driver? That's what I need to know.
Let's talk about it. After his second DNF of the season in Monaco, I started giving up on Lance Stroll. And I started Pierre Gasly in Spain with the hopes of shaking up my fantasy team and moving up the ranks. But the results weren't quite what I was expecting. Gasly and Stroll scored roughly the same number of points, despite some very unique circumstances. Gasly had 2 3-place penalties based on his qualifying impeding activities. But the thing that really set this pairing apart was that Gasly's more expensive than Stroll. So I was only left with enough budget to start either Sargent or Hülkenberg as my 5th driver, and I picked Hulk. And you remember from my chat earlier, Hülkenberg lost a lot of places, and that really hurt for my team. But if you started Stroll, you had enough budget left over to grab Yuki Tsunoda or to grab Zhou Guanyu. And those teams really shined last week. So it is really a battle again for who the number 4 driver is going to be. For me, you've got Lance at home. You've got Tsunoda, who's looking really good. But I'm going to stick with Zhou Guanyu and Stroll. Both finishing the points in this race last year. Both are on a hot streak. Give me Stroll. Give me Zhou.
Okay, interesting. I was going to ask a question now that just popped into my mind, but those penalties, do they take away his overtake points?
The penalties don't take away from the overtake points because those items are based on where they start in the race, not where they qualify from. So Gasly qualified P4, dropped to P10, and then positions gained or lost are based off of P10, not the P4 qualifying result.
I see.
Last year it was different. Last year it was based on the qualifying position, and he would have started the race at a 6 position deficit.
Okay. Well, at least that seems like a positive, change in the game. But speaking of Lance Stroll, I heard him say during Spain last week while I was listening to the radios was, I'm ready for some pancakes with some maple syrup on them. So maybe he'll put something a little sweet on the race this weekend for us too. I mean, I'm excited to watch it.
And I don't know if you saw the quote from his dad, but Lawrence Stroll is predicting a double podium for Aston Martin.
Really?
And the running joke was that they did have a P2 and P3 finish in FP1. But as you know, it lasted 1 lap. So that's why it's the running joke now.
Yeah. So
let's talk now about the weather for this week because it is in flux.
Exactly. I mean, I know a lot of drivers are better in the rain and some are worse. So what kind of thing? What do you think affects that in terms of not only the championship points but the fantasy points as well?
Sure. Let me tell you the latest I know about the weather because the weather forecast for this weekend has even evolved past the graphic we're showing on the screen here. Tomorrow, The percentage of rain is now up to 80%, and they're predicting that will span through both FP3 and qualifying. And then for Sunday, that rain percentage is down to about 22%. So possibly a dry race or only wet on certain parts of the track, or maybe this is all together. So let's talk about what rain means in the fantasy world. There are some drivers that do much better than others. And I think back to Fernando Alonso on this very track last year in the rain, qualifying P2 in a much less efficient Alpine than the Aston Martin he's in now. So a great result for him. And I also think back to Monaco, where both McLarens really excelled once the rain started falling. Might have been a little too late for their race day, but really, really good progress seen from them in the rain.
So speaking of that, do you think the McLarens have a higher chance of qualifying high and then losing places during the race because they do well in the rain on Saturday and then not so much on Sunday?
I'm not sure. It'll be interesting to see how much rain we get tomorrow. The concept of rain obviously causing a little bit of chaos is also paired with the fact that Pirelli has ranked this track as a very high evolution track, which means the more rubber you put down, the warmer you warm up the track, the faster those times are going to get. And so you might have a combination of a track that is ripe for fast lap times, but then the rain comes and you might have some very unexpected qualifying finishes. But I don't know if you saw the quote from Mika Hakkinen earlier this week. He expects McLaren to challenge Red Bull by the end of the year. So he's hearing something that maybe you and I are.
Really? Mika Hakkinen. Interesting. Yeah. So,
Will, before we get into building our team, I'm seeing some questions pop up in the chat.
Oh, sick.
The first one I see is, Yuki used to get emotional. Has he matured and felt more consistent to you? I think I'm definitely seeing fewer Yuki explosions on the radio, but that's probably due in part because he's doing so much better. Fewer frustrations. I think he's definitely matured and he's handling the car better. And I think he really takes seriously this concept of being the number one driver on that team. With him and Gasly, it was a 1A, 1B with Gasly typically ahead. And so it allowed him to be a little more immature, but now he's really stepped up his maturity, both in the car and on the radio.
Yeah. I mean, from what I've seen from Yuki, he's gotten a lot better. It seems like a lot of when he's making mistakes, he's taking responsibility for them, unlike in the past when he would kind of, blame the team or blame the car or whatever it was. Now he realizes that, it's partially his fault as well.
That's true.
We have another question. It says, you mentioned PPM for top teams. Would you go against your normal logic for any experienced driver who can handle the rain consistently?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think when we think about rain, I'm willing to throw caution to the wind and just start the best drivers and see what happens. Unless, of course, we get to Japan later in the season and we're seeing a pattern of a driver consistently not doing well in the rain. I think back to Valtteri Bottas in his Mercedes days. There was a stretch where he was really not handling his business in the rain. If we have a driver consistently not showing up in the rain, I might change my tune by then. But what I've been doing is just start the best drivers that I think will finish the highest, assuming the track is dry. And if the session is wet, that might be a good session for the no negative chip, which if any driver gets negative points, it will set them to 0. Or after qualifying, consider the final fix chip, which allows you to take one driver out of your lineup between qualifying and the race and replace them with a driver that you think will optimize their race result with more points. So I usually employ the chips rather than change around the drivers before the lineup lock deadline.
Interesting. Yeah. That brings me to my next point. Before we set my lineup and before I figure out how to use this website and app, let's go to the FanAmp picks of the week.
Let's do it.
All right. So our picks of the week this week are one for qualifying and one for Grand Prix. And there's multiple questions for each on the app. You can go check it out whenever. But the ones that we're highlighting this week is, how does Stroll qualify relative to Gasly? Do we think he's ahead by 5 or more positions, or do we think he's behind by 5 or more positions, or somewhere in between? And for the Grand Prix question, we have, does Zhou Guanyu finish in the points? And I think that one's a really interesting one.
I'll tell you how I answered it, but I'm interested to see what you put too, Will. So for the Stroll versus Gasly qualifying question, I think what we're going to have is a pretty average result where the two drivers are rightfully right around the same range, with Stroll under 4 positions ahead of Gasly, just slightly ahead. And to the question of will Zhou Guanyu finish in the points, I said no, he won't finish in the top 10, but I suspect a P11, P12 result and several overtakes again, and a good fantasy result for Zhou. What
Yeah,
do
I
you
mean,
think?
respectively, I mean, Joe is kind of average in the rain. Not to say that I would do any better or anything like that, but comparatively and relative to the rest of the other drivers, he seems normal. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of DNFs. He doesn't, have any big crash or anything like that in the rain as of late. But I also don't think he excels in the rain like someone like Alonso does.
It'll be very interesting to see as he gets more and more race experience in the rain under his belt. I think his legacy of how he handles wet conditions will really start to come clear for us.
Yeah, I think it's good. I think people are paying more attention to him now too, as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, Will, you ready to build a team?
Let's do it.
All right.
Let me just share my screen real quick. All right. Is that working?
Not yet. There we go.
Bang. So this is what the Grand Prix website looks like, right? As we can see, something I was taught or something I saw while messing around with this earlier is that not only can we see by who picked him the most. So you can pick Verstappen. See, we have 82% Alonso this week. We can also go by season points, which is the normal, and by the value. So if you're looking for budget drivers, you just scroll down. But today, from what I can understand, I'm picking Max Verstappen. Let me put him over here. Does it really matter what position you put him in?
No, none of that matters.
Perez and Alonso, which seem to be the most bang for your buck in terms of PPM, correct?
That's right. 1, 2, and 3 respectively in PPM on the season. So you're off to a great start.
Yeah. Okay. So Pierre Gasly, 32%. From what I can hear, what I can understand, we're betting on Lance Stroll's hot streak, so I'm going with him. And
now, be careful with your budget at this point, Will, because you're a brand new player this week, so your budget is right at 100 million, which is the baseline for a new player. For those of us that have been playing since Bahrain, we've had the pleasure of having our teams go up in price since the start of the year. So I'm operating with a budget of 102.7. That allows me to afford a little bit more of my team than what you'll end up with here. I recommend going with the best possible constructors and then get a number 4 and number 5 driver that you can afford based off of what's left.
Okay. So I've got 2.1 million. So that leaves me with no
Nobody
driver.
Yet.
So we're going to have to change some things around. So what do you recommend? Do you think I take Sergio Perez out for someone else, or what do you think?
When in doubt, I go for the highest upside. So keeping Verstappen, Perez, and Alonso in, removing Lance Stroll, and let's see what the best of the rest looks like for you.
So I've got 9.7 million to work with, as we can see here. Valtteri Bottas is too expensive. But I think I have enough for Zhou Guanyu, who we have discussed as being better. Alex Albon's 4.9? That's kind of crazy.
He's dropped quite a bit this year. He had a few DNFs that were a bad look for his fantasy line, so he's coming.
And I don't like Nick DeVries because of his face. No, I'm kidding. I mean because of how many points he scores. He's only got 9. So I'm going to pick Yuki Tsunoda.
This is perfect. Our 2 favorite budget drivers, the 2 most consistent in recent weeks, are going to round out your team. This is a perfectly good a team for a new player.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be cooler if I had Lance Stroll, but it is what it is. I'll get what I can get. But yeah, so let me continue. DRS boost, and you recommend putting this on the champ, I imagine.
That's right. Yeah, so we're going to double Max's score this week. Is a plug and play for this for me week in and week out.
Okay, what should we call it? So,
this is harder than it looks. Finding a team that nobody else has picked.
1 second.
While you do that, I found a new question in the chat that says, how do you recommend a new player quickly build more budget to have more combinations available each week?
You think
This is a bit of a struggle because the game increments the value so little week in and week out that it's going to take several weeks for you to build up enough budget to really start to level up your team. But in the article I wrote earlier this week, I summarized the drivers that have gained the most value since Bahrain. Fernando Alonso is by far the asset that's gained the most value. And then Verstappen and Perez have also been gaining a ton of value. So if you continue to ride them and they continue to post top 3 results, your team value will rise as well. And also over on the constructor side, you can see Will has picked Red Bull and Aston Martin. Those are by and large the 1 and 2 most popular constructors in the game. And they're also the 1 and 2 teams that have gained the most value. So a team built around Will's top 5, Perez, Verstappen, Alonso, Red Bull, Aston Martin, is not only going to get you the most points, it's also going to raise your team's value the most too.
Right, because if they score more than a certain amount of points, they increase the value of the driver and the constructor, I imagine.
And look forward to an article from me next week where I break that down. I've taken all of the points scored from every asset in the game and compared it to the budget increase associated with each result. And I'm going to try to make some sense of where Formula One is changing folks' prices. This is a tough nut to crack, and it's not totally consistent, but I think I have a trend just enough to share with all of you.
Okay. I see this apply chips button here. Let me check this out. So you get one of these every week?
You get one of these per year. Be very careful, because once you use it, it's gone forever.
Okay. Why are these locked, if you don't mind me asking?
They're locked for different reasons. So the wild card and limitless chip are locked for new players. I think you have to complete 2 weeks before those chips unlock for you. Just make sure you're invested and you're sticking around. The final fix chip isn't going to unlock for you until after qualifying. That allows you to change one driver out of your lineup after qualifying him before the race. So you got to wait for qualifying for that chip to become available.
And this limitless chip, what does it do?
It does a couple of really cool things. It takes the cost cap and throws it out the window. You can spend on every single expensive asset in the game and just maximize your points in a given week. You can use unlimited transfers and spend as much money as you want. And then after that week, your team will reset to what it was the prior week.
Okay. No negative. You talked about that earlier. Means it's impossible for you to get negative. Extra DRS, I'm assuming, just multiplies their points by 3.
That's right.
Look at me, smart guy. And what does autopilot do, if you don't mind me asking?
Autopilot will take the 2x DRS boost and move it to whoever the highest scoring driver on your team is. So let's take an extreme example. If Verstappen were to DNF this week, it would take that 2x DRS boost and then put it on your highest scoring driver for the rest of that race.
Okay.
So rather than getting, because think about it this way, if you have your 2x boost on Max and he DNFs, that's -40 for the DNF.
Oh, it works in both directions?
Yeah.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yes, you don't want that.
But yeah, this looks like a pretty solid team for my first week. I'm excited. I like my name. Maybe I'll change it next year. But
fantastic. I'm already compiling a list of witty team names that all of you can use to base your 2024 F1 fantasy teams off of.
Awesome. I think I'm gonna stop sharing right now.
Let's do it. And I think that's all we've got for this week. But this has been a real blast hanging out with you, Will, or random smiley face, or just me. We'll wait for you to come back.
1 second.
Ooh, the smiley face talks.
I don't understand what happened there. That's my bad.
That's okay. We're back.
Tech. Anyways, we got through the majority. We almost got through the whole thing with no technical difficulties. It almost happened, but anyways, we're back. I'm back. He's been here. But I had a great time. Thanks for all your help and sending me on my quote unquote fantasy journey.
My pleasure.
I guess I'll see you next week.
And for all of you out there, we've got a little time left between now and the lineup lock deadline. I'll be on my community over on FanAmp, answering all of your questions about your lineups. Maybe they're a little different than mine and Will's. We'll chat a little bit about how we can optimize your teams for success in your leagues this week.
Personal. He's gonna be up close and personally also. If you guys have any questions, please send a message on FanAmp. Go download the app. Follow our Instagram. Follow all of his socials. TikTok. I mean, he doesn't have TikTok, but we have TikTok.
You don't want to see my TikTok.
Follow him on Twitter, Instagram. Go look at his Reddit posts. This is going to be on YouTube, I believe, for recorded, so you guys can watch later if you guys missed it. Go follow us on Twitter, Reddit, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, all of it. We post great stuff every day. So thank you guys for coming. Thanks for all the questions. And have a great weekend, guys. Watch the race.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.